but unfortunately the printer was a little flustered, and there are no two copies identical.
Is that right?
That's right, and thanks to David Burkott for that part of the information. It was revised slightly with about 400 changes in 1614. And then I think it was somewhere around 1762 that they improved the orthography and made a few changes to the words, which is now called the Standard Edition of the King James.
Okay, so when you think about that, already you have a question. Well, you have a lot of questions, because this is what's known as the common version of the Bible, and most people who have a Bible have a King James Version, I would guess. And you're already saying that, first of all, it was written in 1611, but there weren't any two versions that were the same. And then by 1742, it was sort of straightened out. But, you're looking at almost 1,600 years after Christ. How can you get the idea of authenticity from that period of time, especially when in the early part of that period of time there were no printing presses, there were no copy machines. You couldn't scan and fax something. It just was all handwritten work. How do you even begin to figure out authenticity?
You got to compare the manuscripts, especially, and see the older manuscripts. Are they more alike or are they less alike? And they tend to fit into three categories, too. There's one category that people commonly call them Alexandrian types, like the Alexandrian manuscript from Acts through Revelation. Compares quite closely, that's of the early 5th century, compares quite closely to the Sinaitic and the Vatican 1209 manuscripts of the 4th century. And then you see that, you've got a number of papyrus manuscripts from before the time of Constantine, and some of them look very much like one another and like the Vatican and the Sinaitic manuscripts. The Vatican and the Sinaitic are almost complete. Sinaitic is complete. Vatican 1209 has a few of Paul's epistles missing, and the Revelation.
All right, so you have these two manuscripts. You said the Vatican and the Sinaitic that are either complete or almost complete.
That's right.
And when were they compiled?
That would be about the middle of the 4th century, current thinking.
Okay, about the middle of the 4th century. So that is in the 300s, is that right?
That's right.
Right. Okay, all right. So in about the 300s. Still, you have a lot of time that passed before then. How do we figure out what went into those? Because Len, let's go back to this book that you mentioned earlier. One of the most recent books that is out attacking the authenticity of the Bible is a book called Misquoting Jesus, as you had mentioned, by Bart Ehrman. And I just want to read a paragraph or part of a paragraph and get both of your input on it. Okay, he's talking about complications in knowing the original text. He says, that is to say, once a scribe changes a text, whether accidentally or intentionally, then those changes are permanent in his manuscript, unless, of course, another scribe comes along to correct the mistake. The next scribe who copies that manuscript copies those mistakes, thinking they are what the text said, and he adds mistakes of his own. The next scribe who then copies that manuscript copies the mistakes of both his predecessors and adds mistakes of his own, and so on. The only way mistakes get corrected is when a scribe recognizes that a predecessor has made an error and tries to resolve it. There is no guarantee, however, that a scribe who tries to correct a mistake corrects it correctly. That is, by changing what he thinks is an error, he may in fact change it incorrectly. So now there are three forms of the text: the original, the error, and the incorrect attempt to resolve the error. Mistakes multiply and get repeated. Sometimes they get corrected, sometimes they get compounded, and so it goes for centuries. And Len, when you hear that, it sounds like there's no way in God's green earth that you can have the Bible have survived through all of those mistakes.
That's a pretty fatalistic attitude.
Yeah, I know. It's pretty depressing.
And I guess it always comes down to the question of are those changes that were made, are they substantive or aren't they substantive? And I think think that's really where the issue is. It's not, makes it sound like everything in there was subject to question. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think, as we'll see, there is some evidence that, things might have been altered, but in most cases, I think, as Jim has talked about, we can identify those and probably have some pretty good evidence of what was changed and what should be correct. So it's not like every word in there was copied wrong, and that's my objection when I read this book, is that it makes it sound as though every word in the Scripture is subject to skepticism because we can't even rely on it. And I don't think those changes, as we'll see, were always that substantive.
Okay, and it's almost time for another break already, almost. But Jim, in your experience in reading manuscripts and going through all of this, you've seen that kind of variance, correct?
Oh, absolutely. I've seen it, yes.
And in your experience, what is it? What Len is saying, is somewhat theoretical. That's why I'm asking you now, okay, what kinds of differences do you see from one to the other?
There are a lot of spelling mistakes. Some scribes make a lot more of them than others, like secretaries do today, and any time I write something down. But I say a large portion of the others are, one version will say, and he saith thus and so. And the other manuscript will say, and he saith unto them thus and so. Relatively few are really changing the meaning of anything, but there are a few.
And we'll get into those a little bit later.
Okay, sure.
Okay, so basically then you're saying the majority of the errors and the changes would have been very, very small and not changing the meaning, but a little bit of how it's expressed.
Yes, most of the differences we can call trivial.
Okay, all right, well, that's a good way to look at it. Fred, why don't we go into the break at this point? Folks, we're looking at how the Bible was put together and some of the objections to people having about the Bible being authentic.
This is Jonathan and Rick with Christian Questions on News Talk 104.7 WXLM. Does the Bible have integrity? We'll be right back.